Well, look who it is. Back for episode 2. Did you just think I was going to quit after one episode because I was going to realize how hard this content creator shit is? Well, I did. And yet, here we both are, defying the odds. Me making the episodes, you finding the episodes. A couple of people have mentioned to me that I'm kind of hard to find online if you look for A is for Alien podcast. So I just wanted to take this moment to let you know as well that probably the best port of contact for me is through my Instagram, and I have a link tree there which has all of the links to all of the places that you can find me online. So last week I launched a new Reddit page and a Facebook page for us to be able to just shoot the shit and talk about things and, discuss anything that comes up, because you know what, my favorite part of doing this is hearing your guys' thoughts and hearing your guys' experiences. So I'd love it if you want to get involved in that. And, you're really the stars of the show, to be honest. If you don't know what my Instagram handle is, but you are interested in that, it is A is for Alien Podcast, all one word. And it's a picture of me as the profile picture. I don't know who else it would be a picture of. And I also just realized that that's completely useless information if you don't know what I look like. I'm sorry I always end up on these strange tangents. If you're new here, my name is Patrice and I am the host of A is for Alien podcast, the podcast where we talk about the paranormal, the unexplained, the creepy in alphabetical order, because that's the gimmick, baby. Alrighty, so without any further ado, let's get started with episode 2, and today we're talking about Bigfoot. Okay, so last week I watched Dante's Peak again for the first time in I don't know how long. We all know though that it should be called Peak Pierce Brosnan, not Dante's Peak, for obvious reasons. I struggled with Linda Hamilton though in Dante's Peak. It helped that I had recently watched Bermuda Tentacles, and so I feel like when you have that as a baseline, any of her performances is better than Bermuda Tentacles. This might come as a shock to some of you as Americans, because as I understand, you learn about this Mt St Helens eruption in school. In Australia, we don't, and as I was researching this, I found out a lot of people as children were kind of confused about certain things. Like they thought Harry Truman, that lived on the mountain in his lodge, they thought that that was the previous president, Harry Truman. And so there were kids that thought, oh my God, why isn't this being made a bigger deal of? The president's just been killed in a volcanic eruption. I found that quite humorous. So I didn't realise that Dante's Peak was roughly based on the Mt St Helens eruption that happened in 1980. I found out too while I was researching this that there was a movie made in 1981 about the eruption, and I thought that was a bit fresh. So you're probably sitting there thinking to yourself, isn't this a podcast about Bigfoot? And it is, but the Mt St Helens eruption is very important to the story that I'm going to be telling today. So I hope you don't mind. I'm going to take a little bit of time and talk about what actually happened on that fateful day. So Mt St Helens is located in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States in a place called Skamania County, Washington. Prior to 1980, it had been dormant since the 1850s. So for over 100 years, people had been living there, playing there. It was a really popular place for youth groups and summer camps, people holidaying. It was beautiful. It looked like Mount Fuji almost. It's like a postcard world. So with no eruption in living memory, people kind of didn't want to believe that this could be the big one. Several small earthquakes started beginning on the 15th of March, and the volcanologist and geologist believed that that was indicating that magma might have been moving below the volcano once again. So on the 20th of March, their suspicions were confirmed because a shallow 4.2 magnitude earthquake was registered below the volcano's northern flank. And this was the sign that they needed to confirm that the volcano's 123-year hibernation had finally come to an end. So over the next few days, something seismologists call an earthquake storm saturated seismographs. And on the 25th of March, it reached a peak with an earthquake registering 5.1 on the Richter scale. A total of 174 shocks of 2.6 magnitude or greater were registered during those times. On the 27th of March, a sporadic eruption blew a new crater in the old summit crater, and it was 75 meters wide, and it sent an ash column 7,000 feet or 2 kilometers into the air. So a sporadic eruption is when magma heats water which is trapped close to the surface of the ground, and it basically increases in pressure like a pressure cooker until it just explodes. So at this stage, people aren't really worried because it's kind of more like a spectacle as opposed to a danger. Especially if you're used to living in an area where there are active volcanoes. Sometimes they can just do things like this and then go back to normal. It can take them hundreds of years before they actually have some kind of explosive event. So then by the 29th of March, almost as if overnight, a second crater emerged, and there was flames emitting from both of the craters, burning gases, and static electricity from the ash clouds was setting out lightning bolts. So I don't know, I feel like you don't really need to be a geologist or a seismologist or a volcanologist to kind of feel like there's some shit going down. So by the 30th of March, 93 outbursts were reported, and also there was increasingly strong harmonic tremors, which is a sustained release of seismic energy, which normally indicates underground movement of magma. So this kind of shocked the geologist and prompted the governor, Dixie Lee Ray, to declare a state of emergency on the 3rd of April. Dixie Lee Ray, the 17th governor of Washington and also their first female governor. It's an amazing name, incredible. It's the most American name I've ever heard. So things started to get progressively worse on the mountain throughout April. And the United States Geological Survey, or USGS team, determined that in the last week of April, a 1.5 diameter section of the north face was displaced about 82 meters. And so they started to call this the bulge. Throughout the rest of April and early May, it grew by 5 to 6 feet a day. And by mid-May, it had extended out 120 meters north. And it was this bulge area that was the greatest immediate danger. Geologists thought that this could be a landslide risk. So on the 30th of April, Governor Ray issued an executive order that created a red zone around the volcano. And anyone caught in that zone without a pass could face a $500 fine or 6 months in jail. Here is a clip of the 30-year-old volcanologist David Johnston expressing the concerns of the USGS in his own words.
In the initial phases, we'd see probably very large eruptions that would extend high into the air. This would spread ash over large areas in western Washington, maybe possibly in an extreme case even farther east. In the near flanks of the volcano, there would be more damage done by possibly hot avalanches, pyroclastic flows. Farther downstream, we could see mud flows and floods.
Because this is such a symmetrical volcano and because the crater is so high, if there's an explosion, it's probable that the debris, the very hot incandescent ash that would come down, could come down all sides. But right now, there's a very great hazard due to the fact that the glacier is breaking up on this side of the volcano, on the north side, and that could produce a very large avalanche hazard.
Sadly, David Johnston's predictions would prove devastatingly accurate. So any visible eruptions had stopped by the 16th of May, and the following day, the 17th of May, which was a Saturday, public pressure meant that officials allowed about 50 carloads of people who owned cabins on the mountain to go up and take any kind of personal effects that they could carry. On the 18th of May, the activity on Mt St Helens hadn't really changed. The rate of the bulge movement was still steady, sulfur dioxide emissions were normal, ground temperature readings were the same, and nothing had really changed. There was nothing in Johnston's observations that proved anything was unusual. He was on an observation duty posted about 10 kilometers north of the volcano. At 8:32, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake directly below the northern slope triggered that part of the volcano to slide, which is exactly what David Johnston predicted would happen. This was the largest landslide in recorded history. This exposed partly molten rock, causing high-pressure gas and steam to explode northward towards Spirit Lake in a lateral eruption. At the same time, snow, ice, and lots of glaciers on the volcano melted, and that formed a series of volcanic mudslides, which was basically just melted glaciers, ash, and debris, and that reached as far as the Columbia River. This all happened between 7 to 20 seconds after the shock. Sadly, David Johnston's location was on the northern side of the volcano, and moments before his position was hit by the pyroclastic flow, he radioed his famous last words, which were, "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." His body was never found. The Mt St Helens eruption was the deadliest and most economically destructive volcanic event in US history. 57 people perished, 200 homes, 47 bridges, 15 miles of railway and 185 miles of highway were destroyed. Mt St Helens was effectively turned into a lunar landscape.
Nothing matches the map. Where's Spirit Lake? Is that it over there? I can't believe I've camped up in this area. Doesn't look like any place I've ever been before.
So you're probably still thinking to yourself, what does the Mt St Helens eruption have to do with Bigfoot? Well, Washington State is essentially the undisputed home of Bigfoot. And prior to 1980, Mt St Helens had a very special place in Bigfoot lore. In particular, I'm talking about the 1924 Ape Canyon story, where a group of miners, including Fred Beck, were allegedly shot and attacked by a group of ape men that they described being over 7 foot tall. If you'd like to hear me tell that story in greater detail, there's a link in my description box that I have put in there as a little Easter egg for you, as it is an unlisted video. So Mt St Helens and the Ape Canyon incident have connections even to the most famous Bigfoot Sasquatch encounter, that being the Gimlin-Patterson footage, because the mockumentary that they were making was basically cowboys walking through the woods, having flashbacks of Fred Beck's encounter, and a guide essentially telling the story of Fred Beck's Bigfoot encounter through the woods. Roger Patterson had read an interview by Fred Beck, I think in Life magazine or something kind of similar, and it was that interview that got him interested in the topic of Sasquatch and Bigfoot in general. And he had apparently even interviewed Fred Beck prior to 1966. Don't quote me on this because I'm literally using my brain as a resource, but I'm pretty sure that maybe the month before Bob Gimlin and Roger Patterson were at Bluff Creek, is that they were in Washington near Mt St Helens filming. And then they got a tip of Bigfoot sightings near Bluff Creek. So that's the reason why they were there relatively soon after filming the majority of their footage in Washington. From everything that I've read and researched about Bigfoot over the years, I would be confident to put my money on the fact that if there ever was a place where there was a big population of Bigfoot, it probably would have been Mt St Helens prior to 1980. Because obviously after the explosion, after the eruption, the landscape completely changed, and the statistics are quite shocking when you actually think about how much forestry was destroyed in the eruption. It was 600 square kilometers, so that's 230 square miles of forest destroyed in the Mt St Helens eruption, which is obviously Bigfoot's natural habitat. So are there any stories of Bigfoot being injured or killed in the Mt St Helens eruption? Of course there is, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. So the first time I saw this was probably kicking around on Reddit maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, and I kind of felt like it was an interesting story, but I didn't know how much validity I put into it. Like, as most things on the internet, it comes from an anonymous source, from an anonymous government official that doesn't want to be named, and it's a pretty outrageous claim and there's no proof of it. It happened, almost, well, I guess it is 40 years ago now. So without any other kind of evidence, it is just an incredible story. But I still feel like it's a story which is fun to kind of play with and to see if it is possible. So I'm fairly confident that I've found one of the original sources of this story, and it heralds from a Bigfoot blog called Bigfoot Evidence by Sean. I'll make sure that I provide a link in the description box to this blog site in case you want to check it out for yourself. So for context, apparently on this Bigfoot blog, there was a discussion on one of the message boards about a science teacher called Tom Powell picking up a story from an anonymous government employee, alerting the BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Research Organisation, about a Bigfoot being burnt in the Battle Mountain Complex fire in 1999. And this person had seen this story and then decided to write to the owner of the blog with his own story about Mt St Helens. The email reads as follows: Dear Sean, I was reading some of the stories about Mt St Helens on the message boards and wanted to share this one. I only ask that you withhold my name. I was a National Guardsman at the Mt St Helens site, and this is the first time I've ever spoken about what I saw firsthand. I lived in Spokane, Washington, and was 24 at the time all of this took place. I've read some of the other stories and they only tell part of the story. I was placed on a special cleanup crew farther up the mountain. A large tent was set up and it was guarded by armed soldiers who were not part of the guard. There were numerous soldiers on the scene and were not part of the guard. We were given a briefing by a soldier who said that after he spoke to us, we would forget about him and what he said at the end of the mission. This was strange as we had never dealt with anything before. Myself and 4 other guardsmen were told to follow a group of soldiers and not to speak to each other and to remain very quiet overall. We were told to get into a jeep and wait. We sat in the jeep for maybe half an hour. Another jeep arrived carrying a civilian and another member of the military. The civilian was brought into the tent and he emerged a few minutes later, followed by a large hairy creature. It looked like a large man covered in fur, and the best way to describe it was like Beast from X-Men, only brown. The creature looked to have some burns and had a bandage on its arm. At first we were afraid, but when it walked by we could see its eyes and it just looked very sad and somber. He climbed into the back of a pickup with the civilian and the 2 were speaking in a weird language I had never heard. It would cough at times. We followed the truck to different areas. There were 5 total stops. Each time we stopped, we were told to follow the civilian and the creature. Each time we followed them to rocky areas where there were caves. The creature would make a sound and then listen. At the first area he made a sound and we all just waited in silence. After a few minutes, the creature looked at the civilian and then at the ground. The civilian at one point touched its shoulder and called for a canteen to give the creature a drink. The same thing happened at the next area, but this time there was a response to the sound. After a few minutes, 2 soldiers emerged from the cave carrying a badly burned creature just like the one with the civilian. The creature bent down next to it and looked at it for about 5 minutes. It then spoke softly with the civilian. It turned and walked back to the truck, and we were told to follow. As we were walking away, we heard a shot, and we knew it was one of the soldiers putting the creature out of its misery. There was no response at the 3rd or 4th site, but at the 5th there was another return sound to the creature. This time it was different, and the soldiers carried out a creature with a badly burned left leg. We were then ordered to help get a very large stretcher from the truck and to help place the creature on it and carry it back to the truck. We then immediately returned to the base camp. The creature was carried into the tent while the other creature and the civilian spoke. We were ordered to stay in the jeep until we were to be debriefed. As the creature turned to walk into the tent, it looked at us and made a waving gesture with its hand. We took it as a thank you for what we had done. By the time we were ordered out of the jeep, we were all in shock. We were called over to an area to be debriefed, and it was just strange. I will never forget what was said because it was just not what was expected. I thought I would hear, "You took an oath and now you need to live up to it for your country," with a threat also implied. A different high-ranking soldier just said, "Look, do you all really want an explanation? You saw what we were doing. These creatures live in these areas. They mean no harm and want to be left alone. Do you really want to do anything that may cause them trouble? They are like us in a lot of ways. If you need or want to talk about it, then just wait about 30 years. By that time, there will likely be no reason to keep them a secret." We were then ordered back to the guard camp because they were breaking it up so nobody saw too much and knew everything that happened. We did not speak of it, and after a few months I just took the attitude that these things live out there, and honestly, my life is no different because of it. I only bring it up now because people have been writing a lot about Mt St Helens, and I believe that the whole story should be told. I will also say this: I like to camp and hike, and have done so many times throughout the Northwest. Every time I would look for signs of these creatures, tracks, listen for sounds, etc. I never saw or heard anything other than what I did that day on Mt St Helens. Okay, so there's that. Now, is this story plausible in your mind? Do you think that there could have been some reality where a Bigfoot was talking to a civilian under guard, checking for Bigfoot survivors in caves on Mt St Helens? Is that plausible? Well, there are other accounts. Another kind of cool blog is called Kick-Ass Oregon History. They reference a book. The book is written by a lady called Linda Coyle Suchi, and it's called Who's Watching You? An Exploration of the Bigfoot Phenomena in the Pacific Northwest. And apparently this book addresses several stories regarding the Mt St Helens eruption and resulting dead Bigfoot. I couldn't find a copy of this online, and I can't find a physical copy in Australia that I can easily get. But fortunately, this website has excerpts from a Mr. Bradshaw, whose father was a supervisor for Weyerhaeuser. Is Weyerhaeuser like a forestry company or something? Let me know. So he says that after the eruption, he was sent to the Spirit Lake area to help keep curious people out of the way of a helicopter landing zone. And he describes that the National Guard were collecting carcasses of dead animals in heaps and piling them up for eventual cremation. So like there'd be deer, elk, etc., and that the bodies were covered with tarps. So it goes on to say, and I quote, Mr. Bradshaw was placed in charge of one pile of dead animals in particular. The pile was covered and no one was allowed to come near it. Armed US National Guard personnel were guarding this pile. On the day that they were going to move this group of bodies, Bradshaw was standing very close to the pile and was told to keep his mouth closed about what he was to witness. When the tarps were removed, he was amazed to see that the bodies were those of sasquatch, some badly burnt and some not. They were placed in a large net and lifted into the back of a truck, which was then tarped over. Bradshaw asked a guardsman what would happen to the bodies, and the guardsman replied, "They'll study them or whatever, I don't want to know. It's like other stuff you don't ask." Later that day, his father and the rest were debriefed and were told not to talk about what they had witnessed there that day and sent home. Okay, so the book that this excerpt was taken from was published in 2009. So it's entirely possible that the person who has written in this story about actually being part of this National Guard service that drove around with the Bigfoot, deciding which Bigfoot live and die, could have read this book and then be participating in some kind of fandom or adding to this story and adding to the lore of this story. Back on the topic of the email sent to the original Bigfoot blog in 2012, I've learned after years on the internet that the answer is always in the comments. And that led me to finding this really interesting comment, albeit from an anonymous source. I don't know who wrote this story or if they were there, but I can add this much and I will give you facts you can check up on if you feel this is a hoax. But I was an airman in the Air Force in 1980. I was stationed at George Air Force Base from the late 70s to the early 80s. Our mission was the Wild Weasels, or Air Force F-4s, that would go into a war area before it started, like the first Gulf War, at low level and pop up and then light up the ground to air defences and then shoot anti-radiation missiles at the sites, letting the other aircraft get in. In 1980, we were shipped to train with the Canadian Forces at Comox CFB on Vancouver Island. We took a C-141 from George to Canada. Our C-141 had an in-flight emergency and we had to land at Travis Air Force Base in Northern California for repair. We were losing hydraulic fluid in one engine and I saw the crewman come back and dump several cans of hydraulic fluid into the reservoir and it just went back to zero. Kind of made me nervous. But we later got back on our way and flew over St Helens right after it blew its top. Once we got to Comox, our officer in charge told us that we would be there for longer than the 2 weeks due to an emergency mission that they needed help on. We were all specialised airmen trained in different specialities in aircraft maintenance and repair, but we were soldiers first and we did lots of other stuff that our country needed. We were there for a couple of days not doing anything because as I look back, they were trying to figure out how to use us. Then we all got on a bus and were bused to an area around the south end of the island and were picked up on a strange naval ferry. I'd never been in the Navy, so I don't know anything about boats. The bus was tied down and delivered to the US side and we drove off. It was under darkness and it was typically cloudy and rainy. We continued our bus ride to the disaster area. We were given M16s and one mag, which I found fascinating because most Air Force enlisted troops shoot a gun in basic, and you never see an M16 again. We were given ill-fitting green helmets marked guard and ill-fitting plain green BDFs and told to follow orders we were to be given in the upcoming briefing. In the briefing, we were told that we would be guards to special areas and told to check credentials and to only allow people in who had the correct credentials into the military tent areas that were set up, what looked to be like on the area perimeter of the eruption. We had no idea where we were at. There were no towns or cities around where we were, and we arrived there, we were about 30 airmen completely and totally confused on what was going on. Apologies if that makes no sense. I'm reading it word for word, and I don't know if it's coming out as dyslexic as it's going into my brain, but it was definite word salad just then. We slept in a tented area that was near where we worked. We had a mess tent next to the tent where we slept, and we didn't leave that area about an acre size for a week or more. Most of us, if not all of us, were guarding areas that people moved into and out of with what looked like victims. The tents we guarded had a foyer area and we couldn't see what was behind the second door. It was brightly lit and you had to go through a couple of partitions to get to the main area of the tent. I assumed they were there to prevent people peeping into the tents. It was very infrequent that anyone walked in or out, and we worked 12-hour shifts only at night. We were used to working 12-hour shifts because this was just after the Iranian crisis, and we would go on alert every 3 days, work 12-hour shifts flying as many missions as we could, then have a day off, then another alert and 3 more weeks of 12-hour shifts for 3 more weeks. We were told that if anyone tried to breach our area to shoot. That never happened or came close to happening. This was funny to me because we were given 1 magazine, and I don't know if the bullets were real or not. We were Air Force, not Marine. I knew more about a 5-iron than an M16, but nothing ever came up. The only time anyone came up to the area I was guarding only happened after midnight, and it looked to me like a doctor in a white lab coat with either a patient or a victim who was wrapped in what looked like overcoats and our night shift navy blue ski caps. You could see the person who was led into or out of the tents because they had their hands in the coats and were led into the tent by the arm. I think I was there for 8 to 9 days, and it was the most unusual thing I had ever experienced in the Air Force. Out of those nights on guard, I noticed 2 out of the people that were escorted were very tall. That's the only thing I noticed were those 2 tall people. I was not in a position to see how tall they were, but it was obvious that they were a whole head higher than the doctor, if that's what they were. Only the escort talked, and they only mentioned their last name and showed their badge. I don't know if they were army or civilian. The other thing I noticed was the escorted people were really wide, but I always assumed until now that it was the coats that they were wearing. It was very nippy, and I also assumed we were at some kind of altitude. After that, we were given a debrief that we had helped a lot of the people who were victims of the eruption. That's all that we were told. And told that we were not to mention this part of our TDY. After our last shift, and I don't know how long that was, but it was longer than a week, we were allowed to sleep. Then the next evening we were allowed to shower. We were only allowed skin baths with washcloths until then, in another tent that was behind the latrine tent and shower tent, given back our original Air Force uniforms and put back on the same bus we rode in, and bussed back to the same area under darkness, ferried back to Vancouver Island and back to Comox CFB. We continued our TDY as if nothing happened. We did 2 more weeks of flying shorties with the Canadians, played and drank a ton of Canadian beer, Labatt's Blue, and flew in our C-141 back to George Air Force Base. It was all a big mystery on what happened until I read this story, but it seems similar. But they must have been really short on personnel to use a bunch of Air Force kids as guards, or they thought nothing would ever happen. But that's the only time I ever pulled guard duty outside of basic training at San Antonio. Full disclosure, I completely believe that there were Bigfoot on Mt St Helens in 1980, so straight away I'm already on board with this. I don't necessarily know if these stories are true, but I do feel that in some kind of incarnation, a part of these stories could have been potentially true, or parts of them were true. So now I know what you're thinking. You're sitting there and you're thinking, Patrice, even if there were Bigfoot on Mt St Helens, the pyroclastic flow would have killed them, just like they killed David Johnston. And you know you're right, because pyroclastic flow is this chaotic mix of like rock fragments, gas, ash, and it's super hot, like it's over 800 degrees Celsius. So if you are unfortunate enough to be stuck in the path of a pyroclastic flow event from a volcano, you're probably more than likely going to be vaporized before you even realize what's hit you. I knew you were going to ask this question though, so I prepared myself for it. I present to you Ludger Silbaris. Ludger was a survivor in the city of St Pierre on the Caribbean island of Martinique during the 1902 eruption of Mount Pelée, which happened on the 8th of May 1902. So the city that he was in, St Pierre, was in the direct path of a pyroclastic flow, and it destroyed the city and killed 30,000 people. But Lutger was in prison. He was arrested for either being involved in a bar fight or a street brawl, and he was thrown into jail overnight for assault. And basically, he ended up being put into a solitary confinement jail cell, which happened to be partially underground. But what also happens to be underground are cave systems and lava tubes. So not many people live to tell the tale of what happens when you're directly in the path of a pyroclastic flow event. But this gentleman did. And it's pretty crazy because essentially this vertical cloud of ash and smoke and hot gases like rushed down this mountain and took out the whole of St. Pierre in about a minute. And it killed everybody because they were either burnt or suffocated. He said that hot air mixed with the ash entered into the cell door, and he tried to like urinate on his clothes and stuff it in the door to stop it from coming into his cell. He said that the heat lasted only for a really short time, but it was enough to burn him. So his hands, legs, arms, back, everything was burnt. And he said too, during that time, he just held his breath to stop him from breathing in the hot air. So I guess in a way that's a proof of concept that if you had the right circumstances and the right environment, you would be able to survive a volcanic eruption and a pyroclastic flow. If you happen to be a Bigfoot that was hiding in a cave, that is. Okay, so I can't wait to hear what you think. Do you think that there were Bigfoot on Mt St Helens in 1980s? Do you think that there were teams of special forces people that were brought in to find bodies? Do you think that scientists took them away to experiment on them? Do you think that Bigfoot still lives on Mt St Helens now? Or do you think that Bigfoot's moved on and is somewhere else? Well, I hope that you can stick around a little bit longer because that's what I'm going to be talking about with my guest in the next segment. Alrighty, so for this part of the podcast, I'm now joined by my special guest who just also happens to be my dad. Hello, Dad.
Hi, Patrice. How are you going?
Good. How are you going, Dad? Thanks for joining me at such late notice.
That's fine.
So I wanted to know, Dad, when did you first learn about Bigfoot? Do you remember?
Would have been, was my mum, your granny. I got a book from Reader's Digest. It was just one that covered multiple things. It was a big purple book, just on one of the Reader's Digest. Buy a book or buy a couple of books, etc. So it had stories covering multiple different areas, ghosts, Bigfoot, Yeti, Loch Ness Monster, all these sort of things and that sort of stuff, but also science, space. It was, just a mixture of everything. So only small little segments of everything, but, some stories, etc. I think that Ape Canyon one was in there. And that sort of thing.
What do you think that out of all of the cryptids that's the most plausible one?
Yeah, I think so.
Because, I want to believe in Loch Ness Monster, but I feel like Bigfoot is, you're someone who spent a lot of time kind of in nature. You could look at those, like obviously in New Zealand, not in America, but it doesn't take, too much imagination to imagine that the landscape in New Zealand, like especially in the alpine areas, is quite similar to some of the areas that Bigfoot would have been, said to have been in as well. So that there's, when you've got access to fresh water and, grubs and birds and, this, like kind of prey animals.
Well, there is multiple, now more than before, food sources for such an animal and that sort of thing. But yes, I never had heard stories or legends of such a type of creature, animal in New Zealand, right? Like I said, the only ones I've read about the Bigfoot in North America and the Yetis in the Himalayas. Well, right? So
that's what I was just about.
And miles away.
So that's what I was just about to say. Like, I feel like, I think that maybe the first place that I heard of it was Harry and the Hendersons.
I love that movie. That was a good one.
No, that is a good one. But also, you know, with the New Zealander being one of the first people to climb Mount Everest too, Edmund Hillary, who's it?
Edmund Hillary, yes.
Yeah. And they had, I think, a Yeti story, didn't they? They saw footprints up there.
Yeah, monastery with supposedly a scalp of a Yeti. I think they did some DNA testing on that, and it was goat.
No, I thought that Edmund Hillary had an actual story.
Yeah, I don't know about that one. I know there was guys that had, which was in the book, the Reader's Digest one, which was pictures of footprints in the snow in a high mountain pass.
Yeah.
With pickaxe or the snow axe next to the footprint for, scale and that sort of thing. And there was a whole trail of them going across this high mountain pass and that sort of thing. That I remember that one specifically because that's wild, you know.
So this here, I just tried to find that about Edmund Hillary. So in 1953, so Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay reported seeing footprints while scaling Mount Everest. Hillary would later discover Yeti reports as unreliable. In his first autobiography, Tenzing said that he believed the Yeti was a large ape, and although he had never seen it himself, his father had seen it once or twice. But in his second autobiography, he said that he had become much more skeptical about its existence. So they had seen, and I remember that from a book or something that we had as kids that I think Granny might have sent over about Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay.
Yeah, well, famous, both of them. The Sherpa believe in Yeti, right? It is the same as the North American First Nation people, etc. believe in Sasquatch, right? A credible living entity to them.
Yeah, some of the footprints that you see online, I think the footprints that they saw in 1951, there is that famous picture of the Bigfoot footprint with a pickaxe. And I think that was taken from one of Edmund Hillary's reconnaissance missions before he actually climbed it himself.
Yeah, it's a snow axe, not a pickaxe, but it's something that they use in mountaineering and that sort of thing. So that was placed next to it as a size reference.
Yeah.
Because I don't think you carry a tape measure when you're mountaineering.
Well, you would if you thought you were going to see a Bigfoot. You need to get it out and be like, it's definitely 7 foot tall.
No, well, yeah, I suppose you would then.
So do you think that it was possible then that they could have been living on Mt St Helens in the 1980s?
Yeah, it's beautiful, mountainous, vegetated area. So you'd have lots of game, fresh water sources all around, all that sort of stuff. It's secluded, so there's no doubt that there was or could have been a population of them there.
But what do you think about those stories about them surviving and being spoken to by soldiers? And do you believe in those stories?
Well, there's several different accounts of very similar occurrences, in those stories.
I know, but I just always think that it's easy to hide behind an anonymous profile online.
Oh, yeah. No, and that is always a possibility. Some people look for that notoriety or a little segment of fame by making up crap, right? It could well be that, but then the thing there too, it may not be. It could be true in some respects. Like sometimes truth has multiple layers. There can be a small part of truth in it, a lot of fabrication, or it can be the other way around, right? A lot of truth, but hardly any fabrication. You don't know. Without people, exposing themselves and saying, yeah, it's me, I was here, blah, blah, blah,
See, I think that, a main theory on the Bigfoot is that they are migratory and that they do move around and that they follow, because when you look at those maps, like there's lots of maps that people have, there's on the internet that you can find that are like Bigfoot sightings compared to like cave systems and like mountain areas.
Yeah, and you would suspect to a larger animal requiring nutrients and nutrition, etc., would follow game. So with the movement and seasonal crops, wild crops in the areas and that sort of stuff, so they would do the same thing. They would be migratory. They would move to where the food supply was the most plentiful. Plus, if you stay in one area, you deplete your food supply, so you have to move anyway. So if you do a migratory system moving around nomadic, you're keeping your food supply up, moving to where you know. And
see, I think like, see, I wonder though, if they would be, if they did exist, if they would hibernate. I don't know, do any apes hibernate?
Not that I know of. No. The thing there, it's always a possibility.
See,
other mammals hibernate as such, put on fat layers and, like bears, etc.
see, I just remember when I did that episode on Full Metal Tuxedo about the Art Bell story that was really similar, like that guy called in and his account was really similar to the story that that the Fred Beck said about on, like, which happened in Ape Canyon. That was obviously on Mt St Helens, but the story that the guy rang in about on the Art Bell show in the 90s, that happened on at Olympic National Park.
Yeah, what?
So that's
From a van.
yeah, because that was basically a very similar thing. They had like a camper trailer that they were camping in, and they were just playing cards. So it wasn't like a caravan. I think it was like a smaller caravan. Like it wasn't like a typical kind of big caravan. It was just a smallish one. And they were playing cards, and they could hear like rocks being thrown at the caravan. And it like went on all night, and they were basically just like laying on the bottom of this trailer with these rocks being thrown at them. And when they got out, there was like boulders around their cars and everything.
Yeah. But they could have camped in an area where these guys were staying for a particular length of time, right? Which means you're mucking up their area that they're going to hunt in, or just using at the moment.
See, but what I thought was interesting about that, so that story was from the 70s, but that behaviour is very similar to the story that happened in 1924.
Yeah.
And
that was because, well, that 1924 one, they were making vocalisations, and when that guy saw that one and shot at it, therefore that kind of retaliation was because they had wounded or killed one of their companions, hey?
Yeah, well, I think, in that story, what was interesting with Fred Beck talking about what happened was that he had said that he had shot him, but I had always thought that they had killed the Bigfoot in the first part of the story. So it was really interesting to find out that they actually killed him like later. So the one that actually died, and the reason why Ape Canyon was called Ape Canyon was like after it was all said and done, they like shot him at the end.
Yeah, but did they wound the first one or not?
Well, Fred Beck says that when they shot at it, that they thought that they hit the tree because they saw bark fly off the tree.
Oh, right.
And then they saw this creature like running, and so then Fred Beck like shot at it as it was running.
Yeah.
But
there, see, you don't have to die immediately from a gunshot wound. You can bleed out and all that sort of stuff, hey?
Yeah, I guess so. Maybe it was one that died.
If it was wounded or something or hurt,
See, but with that story, I think to myself, like, what's similar with it is that there always seems to be kind of legends of monsters or some kind of hairy ape man around places where work's being done, or like in this case, that was a gold plot. So it's like they would probably want to make stories up like that to stop people from going out there.
Oh, I guess, and that's always a possibility as well. But then also, as people are inquisitive and go and look at different things because they want to know and have a look, other animals do that as well. You know, they will, because something's different in their environment, they'll go and have a look.
Well, that was the reason why, with the Patterson Gimlin footage, they said that that's the reason why there was so much activity, because there was like a roadwork construction workers out there making new logging road. So that's the reason how they...
A lot of noise, a lot of activity.
And that's, I think, was the most compelling part of that story for me, was how the Bigfoot investigators that were out there before, I don't know if it was Ivan Sanderson or who exactly it was, but in that month before the Patterson Gimlin footage was filmed, they found like hundreds of tracks, not just like one or two, but it was like hundreds on that particular ridge.
Which makes it less likely to be a hoaxer. Like, you're not going to go and do hundreds of tracks. You might do one track way if you're making a pretend, hey?
Well, and that's the thing, because apparently, like, there was a lot of correlations between the fact that it always tended to be either people working on like logging crews or roadworks in forestry areas that would find these tracks, and a lot of people said that it was them that would actually fake them themselves because they wanted to like creep each other out, because they'd have to, in those days they'd be like camping out there for like months or in cabins, you know, so it was almost like practical joking. But I think it made it a bit different when it was like hundreds of tracks and also different sizes.
Yeah, that makes it more plausible. The thing there with blokes working out in rough areas, you always do that sort of tomfoolery.
But yeah, like you said, hundreds of tracks make it a little bit different.
Yeah, well, who wants to walk around with a big pair of feet on making hundreds of tracks, right?
And that's the thing too, is that it went through forest as well. So not just on the mud on the side of the road.
Yeah, which makes it hard. And if they're only a wooden cutout or something, you're risking doing yourself serious injury mucking about in a forest area, you know? Making some pretend tracks to freak your mates out.
Yeah, I often wonder where the Patterson Gimlin footage actually is now, because I think last I heard it was in like a lawyer's office in Florida somewhere. And it's interesting because the original film, with modern kind of film techniques now, they'd probably be able to make it absolutely incredible. But it's because that particular film that they had, they would be able to, like, there was something special about that particular film that made it like really incredible quality. And so the quality of the film that we see on, you know, in documentaries or on the internet, like every time it's kind of copied, it degrades. So the original kind of master reels have got the clearest version of it, which now, if it was remastered with the technology that we have now, we'd be able to see things with heaps more clarity. But because of the legal battle that's apparently going on around it, no one has access to it.
Hopefully one day it does become available for those new techniques to have a go at it.
And also like the second reel of film, like apparently there's another reel that shows like Bob Gimlin jumping off the log next to it, trying to show that they couldn't have made the indentations, because even jumping off, they couldn't make it as deep as the footprints that they had seen there.
Yeah.
So I don't know, there's a lot about that story which makes it, you know, interesting, and even third party corroboration that even like a few days after it had all happened, there was another kind of cryptozoologist that went out there and found more tracks through the bush around that area as well as the original ones that Roger Pattinson and Bob Gimlin saw.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I definitely think that they're definitely around that kind of area. I'd love to see one day. Do you reckon you're ever going to get out there, Dads, try and look for a Bigfoot?
I don't know about that. I couldn't even see the one or the creature that came close to me.
Yeah.
So, and it was not too far away.
Yeah. That's it. That's a perfect segue into the next segment, actually. All right, Dad. Well, thanks for taking the time to sit here and talk to me about Bigfoot.
No worries. It was enjoyable.
All right.
Good to talk to you, Trish.
No worries. Thanks, Dad.
Bye.
All
Love
right.
ya.
Love you too. Bye-bye. When people think of Bigfoot or think of any kind of hairy ape man, it's natural to think of the Northern Hemisphere. But down here in the Southern Hemisphere, we also have our own versions of Bigfoot. And that is the subject of my listener email this week. So hopefully you guys can stick around for that because that's coming up right now. Hi, hope this finds you well. My name is Brett and I'm writing to you about an incident that happened to me when I was 16 years old in 1979. My family owned a farm on the edge of a large lake in the centre of the North Island of New Zealand. This occurred in early spring, September in the Southern Hemisphere. A cold southerly weather system had been covering the country for 4 days prior and had now almost blown itself out. Although the wind was still consistent, the rains and storm conditions had passed over. It was a Sunday afternoon, about 1400 hours, and the sun was out for the first real time for a couple of days, so I decided to go for a rabbit shoot. Dressed in jeans, a t-shirt, and red gumboots, I grabbed my green raincoat, filled one pocket with bird shoot shells, and the other I put 4 buckshoot and 2 solid shells, in case I saw larger game. I took the double-barrel shotgun out of the wardrobe and headed out. It took me a couple of hours to walk down the farm looking for rabbits without any luck, before I reached the boundary fence between the farm and the bush reserve that led to the lake itself. There was a small, shallow valley about 50 metres past the fence that had a covering of grass and was pretty clear of thick vegetation, except for some clumps of pampas grass. It was a good spot for deer and pigs to graze and be out of the wind. The wind was blowing directly off the lake and into my face, so scent and sound away from the area I was heading to. I unloaded the shotgun and climbed through the fence. On the other side of the fence, I reloaded it with buckshot and headed along the edge of the gully that fed into and looked over the small valley. I reached the small finger of high ground where 2 gullies met and sat down to watch and listen. The only noise was the wind blowing through the brushes and trees. I couldn't see or hear any movement in that area below me, so I just waited. It would have only been about 10 minutes when to the south of me, close to the lake shore, a huge crashing and bashing in the scrub occurred. I stood up to listen, thinking it must be deer fighting, then what sounded like a tree falling over. After that, the noise stopped. I remember thinking, cool. If it had been earlier in the day, I might have headed that way to check it out, but the sun was already low in the sky, and from where I was, to get there, it would have taken me an hour or so I sat back down and continued to observe the location I had chosen. It would have been another 10 to 15 minutes gone by when I started to hear movement in the bush in the direction from where the ruckus had occurred earlier. It was nothing loud, just the odd twig snap, crunch here and there, but it was heading towards me. I stood up and moved behind a log, shotgun pointed towards the approaching sound, pulled my hood over my head and settled in behind the log. Here I was thinking a deer was heading towards me. The strange thing to me at this stage was the rate that it was moving even when noise was being made. Normally pigs, deer and even hunters will stop and listen to see if anything reacts to a twig or a branch break they make. But this just continued on at a regular unbroken rate. Having grown up here and hunted, trapped and played in this bush, being very thick, the straightness and direction was strange also. Now this is where it gets weird. I started to smell an odour, light at first, but as it got closer, the smell became overpowering. I can still remember it vividly. A combination of rotting meat, fermenting urine and feces, and a dirty, wet dog billy goat stench all mixed together. My first thought was something that smells like that shouldn't be walking. Whatever it was had moved close enough to me that I could hear the footfall as it approached, heavy and strangely bipedal in sound and nature. It would have been about 40 meters away, and the smell in my nostrils was shocking. So I started to breathe through my mouth, which was a bad move as now I could taste it, and it tasted exactly like it smelt. I pulled my t-shirt up to cover my nose and mouth and continued to breathe through my mouth. Between me and whatever this was the second gully that formed the finger of the high ground overlooking the little valley. Bush covered the sides and the top. I was waiting for it to reach there and, like all animals, stop, assess the situation and then move. This would give me time to identify the target and take the shot or not. It continued forward, steps, footfall distinct, until it was about 5 meters from the edge of the gully, 15 to 20 meters away from me, and it stopped. I craned my head to listen for breathing, a snort, a sniff, or any other kind of noise, but nothing. I raised up to see if I could see anything over the top of the bush. Nothing. It felt longer, but it was probably only 20 to 30 seconds before it started to move, away to my right. I followed the movement with the barrel of the shotgun. It was following the edge of the gully, always obscured by the view from the bush, but moving to my side, flanking me. I stood up, shotgun ready, following the movement and sound, still seeing nothing. When it reached a level position with my own in relation to the wind, that's when I said to myself, if it didn't know I was here, it does now. I broke the shotgun in half, thumb over the shells, and headed to the boundary fence. I can't remember if I climbed through or over the fence, but I got about 20 meters into the paddock, snapped the shotgun closed, and took a knee, aiming at the bushline, scanning the whole area. I stayed like this for a whole 10 minutes, but I never heard any sound of movement. The sun had almost set as I started back towards home, getting there in the dark. Needless to say, I didn't unload the shotgun until entering the house gate. For perspective, I had read about Yeti in the Himalayas and Bigfoot in North America, but I'd never heard any legends or stories of creatures like that here. It was a strange experience, and nothing like that has ever occurred to me again. Thank you for using this, if you do. Brett. Okay, so for full disclosure, I have no reason to believe that this person is lying to me, and it's a story that I've heard many times since I was a little girl, and that is because the person who wrote this week's submission is my dad, who's been speaking to me about Washington Bigfoot and the Mt St Helens eruption in the previous segment. And so I asked my dad to sit down with me and we just discussed a little bit more about his experience. So let's talk about your experience then, Dad. So it was spring.
Early spring, yeah. So winter had just finished. It was real early in the spring.
So do you think and so it had been raining?
It had been raining for 3 days before that, really strong winds. In New Zealand, we get a lot of storms come from the Antarctic straight up, so from the south, straight up over the island, bringing snow, sleet, heavy rains, heavy winds, heavy tidal surges to the island. And that happens, we've just had one just recently, that passed about a week ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that happens through the winter and into early spring, we'll get that sort of stuff. And it can, even depending on weather conditions, can happen in the middle of summer. Get one of those cold blasts of air coming up, and that can cause snow in the high country in the middle of summer.
So was it snowing before? Do you remember? Did it snow on the mountain?
It did, yeah, put a covering on the mountains. But only, there was still snow there from the winter, but it did drop some fresh snow on the mountains and that sort of stuff.
I don't know, I always find after it rains, everything smells clean. So do you think that maybe it was because had been raining that you could smell it clearer because there was less other smells around? Or the fact that it had gotten wet and it made it smell worse?
No, the breeze, or like the wind, it was stronger than a breeze, was blowing directly from the south, so from behind it to me, right? So that carried it to me a lot more than if it had been a gentle breeze or no breeze, right? So I could smell it from a greater distance than probably what it would have been if there hadn't been that wind behind it. I don't think it was, yes, it had rained and everything was, clean, but it wasn't the fact that, I don't think it was because the creature itself was wet.
You know, the other thing too I was thinking about is that the crashing and bashing and the tree snapping, that's something that a lot of people report with Bigfoot sightings too, is that they'll hear trees snapping and that's like intimidation.
No, it was very far away when it initially did that. See, I'd only just got to where I was sitting down. I've been there 10, 15 minutes at the most, looking over the little valley that I thought there was the possibility that deer or pigs could be in there grazing, right? This happened down on the lake shore. It sounded like it was real close to the lake shore, and it
Yeah.
was like, you know, a crashing, bashing, smashing, and then the definite sound of like a tree falling and crashing into the bush, and then it stopped. There was no more noise. Now that there, and if I had been earlier in the day, I would have made my way around to there to see what was going on, right?
Because,
but it was later in the day. You know, daylight was going to run out shortly, you know, a couple of hours, right? And it would have taken
I
me
think just for everybody that's listening, like where Dad's farm was when he was growing up, the sun basically when it goes behind the mountain is just gone, isn't it, Dad? Like it goes behind and then it's like
there's
dark.
A short period of twilight, you know, like a bit of a purple haze, and then bang, it's dark. So it's not a lingering twilight or anything like that. It goes almost from as soon as the sun goes down behind the mountains, bang, she's out there. You're in darkness.
To get from that fence, the boundary to through the bush, it does take about 45 minutes, doesn't it? When you're going through, I remember doing that.
Down
to the lake, it's about 45 minutes.
The track.
Yeah.
And for me to have walked out from where I was and walked down to where that trackway leads down to the lake, it would have taken me at least an hour, right? And then you got to have a look. The direction it came from would have taken me 2 hours or more to walk through there.
Was it up on that ridge, or was it the other side towards the Pattersons?
It was almost directly down between, you know, where the track leads to the lake. It was between that and the cliffs on the left.
Yeah.
Right, and that's where I was. So that crashing and bashing and the tree toppling event, I think that was an attempt to say, hey, something interesting over here, come over here. And when I didn't react to that, like in that Finding Bigfoot, you see those guys, you know, when they've got those night vision cameras on their faces and that sort of thing, and they hear a tree topple.
Yeah.
Right, and they go, oh, something's happening over there, and then they're like a mob of emus, you know, heading in that direction. And whenever I saw that happening, I always thought to myself, nah,
you should
sit
stay
down,
where you are.
Get your gear out, because you haven't reacted. There's something there that they're trying to draw you away from, something, whether it's young or, you know, mothers with young or whatever. There's something there that they don't want you there. So, because there was no need for it to do that, you know. Like I said, it was a kilometre and a half away from me. So therefore I was in no way going to notice it at all, whatever it was doing, right? So it made that as like a lure for me, like, hey, something interesting here, come and have a look, which would move me away from the position where I was. And because, like I said, light was running out, or would have run out by the time I'd got down there, come back, right? I was in the place that I had intended to go, because I stood up and looked in that direction that the noise was coming from and that sort of thing. And like I said, man, that sounds cool, because I thought it was possibly a couple of deer having a fight, and then it's finished. And you go, wow, that was cool. Sat back down, observing the valley that I was looking over. And like, when I say valley, it wasn't like a giant deep valley. I was like 10 to 15 feet higher than the floor level, right? But it was beautifully grassed area, you know, and openness, which was, and it had early spring. The grass was lush, you know, it sprouted quickly, and especially with the rains, even though they were cold, you know, everything was it was perfect.
Yeah.
And the breeze was blowing in the right direction, so that my scent and any noise that I made was blowing away from the location.
Ever find any strange happen to the animals down there?
No.
Like anything dead or
events where you'd find dead animals in the paddock and look like they'd been attacked or anything like that. We did have you know, you had the pigs would come and scavenge any dead carcasses that you left lying out, but it was never like something had come on purpose, attacked any of the livestock on the farm.
Because I was wondering about how, obviously it says here when we were looking up like the Mahau Man, which is the New Zealand version of Bigfoot, how they said that they would like snap necks and things like that. So I just wondered if there was anything, if you ever found anything strange down there in those bottom paddocks.
Well, there, you know that we had quite a large number of stock and that sort of thing. So if they came onto the farm and did take a sheep,
You wouldn't
they'd
notice.
take it with them, wouldn't they?
Yeah, you wouldn't notice unless it had been disturbed.
And then you wouldn't notice, right? They would have, if that was their intention, harvest an animal off the farm and being sheep, right? You would assume that they, the same as like the Bigfoot in America, they pick up the dead deer animal and that sort of thing and take it with them because that's they're killing it. They're killing it for food, so you take it with you. Same as hunters for deer, etc. You kill something, you've killed it because you want to eat it. Hey?
So when you were there and you like realized that this thing was flanking you and it was coming up to the side, did you ever feel like afraid? But was it more than just how you would normally be? Like, you know how some people that have Bigfoot encounters talk about how they just get like an overwhelming sense of dread?
Well, when it stopped dead in front of me, you know, like that 20 metres away, and see, that was weird, right? Because it was like it knew exactly where I was. Like it had walked directly from where it had made the noise in a straight line, hardly making any noise at all, through bushland that I've walked through, and you sound like you're a herd of elephants, even if you're one person, right? And this very marginal sounds, the odd snap and crunch and that sort of stuff, through stuff like I just said, me to walk through it, I would have sounded like a herd of elephants coming. This was, and you know, the noise was direct straight line. It was this. I was walking across, you know, a beautiful flat paddock from A to B, and that's how I walked. And I grew up in that area. I grew up on that farm. I grew up, you know, mucking about in that bush, hunting in that bush, trapping possums in that bush. There's no way you can walk in a straight line without making a hell of a racket. And at the pace it was walking and the length of time it took to travel from where it had been to where I was, no way, right?
And you know when you said it was stopped like 20 metres off, was it in a position where you should have been able to see something?
No, the bush, like I said, the bush is very thick. Like you've got those ferns that grow, the pig fern,
Yeah.
the silver fern type stuff. That was very thick and that grows, you know, 6-7 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
You have brackeny type stuff, small shrubs, trees, young trees growing. It was very thick. It stopped where I couldn't see it, right? When I was thinking it was a deer coming, I was thinking it would come to the edge of the gully, would have to, you know, survey the situation to find out where it was going to go, and that's when I could have taken, you know, identify your target, take the shot, yes or no, right? But this stopped 5 metres from the edge of the gully, right? And then it started to walk, you know, and it stayed there, like I said, it felt longer, but it was probably 20 to 30 seconds. I'm listening, you know, I'm listening for a snort or a sniff, a growl, anything, you know, heavy breathing because it's just walked a K and a half through the thick bush and there was no sound at all. Now there, I can't remember the smell while it was standing in front of me because my attention was more, you know, working the eyes and the ears, trying to see what it was. So that sense of smell, I can't remember it smelling then. It probably was, but I can't remember it because I'm more concentrating on trying to see it and trying to hear what was going on. But then as it started to walk away to my right, which is where it was starting to go around the shape of the gully, it stayed pretty constantly to the 5 metre distance of bush. And when it first started moving, I was still down behind the live with just the barrel of the shotgun above the live and, you know, my head and shoulder. And I started to follow it, but as it continued to move further around, I stood up and was looking, you know, I had and flying with the barrel. I could not see anything then either, except, you know, the distinctive footsteps, right? And like when it's heading towards you, you can't really tell how big they are.
Yeah.
Right? But as it was walking to my side, the steps from footfall to footfall, the noise was, you know, was larger than what you would expect of a person, like heaps larger. Because because it moved quickly, because it was like a semicircle as it's moving around.
Yeah.
And it sounded wide steps, right, real wide, from footfall to footfall. And once it got level with me and the wind direction, so we're at 90 degrees to each other in the winds, so it can smell me, that's when I exit stage right?
Yeah. You're like, I don't have the upper hand anymore. Because like you said, if that thing had made that distance in that time, then it could have been on you in like seconds.
Oh, yeah. I wasn't thinking in that regard. But once, I was thinking, mate, if it didn't know I was here, it does now. But like for it to have stopped dead in front of me, like that 20 metres away, it knew exactly where I was, right? So this, and I don't think they have to walk heavily all the time either, right? The smell, constant speed straight towards me, and heavy footfalls, it's all intimidatory stuff to get me to exit the area, you know? It wasn't aggressive in forms of attack. It was just to freak you out so that you go, man, I'm getting out of here. And once it started flanking me and was directly on my side, it did freak me out. That was it.
That's not the only weird thing that's ever happened down that end of the farm, is it? Do you reckon it's just because of
How do you mean?
just because of the, like, near the water? Like, you know, there's heaps of kind of strange stories that you told us when we were kids about the bottom end of the farm.
No, there has been none that happened to me, but stories that people have relayed about stuff that's happened in that area.
Well, even like in that same area down at the bottom of the farm, that was when me, Mum and Kane went on that hike and saw that strange, it was almost like a nest. So
Up on the ridge.
yeah, so we had been, like, Dad didn't come with us when we went and saw Granny and Granddad that time. So Mum was with us and I was there with my younger brother, and we had gone for, like, you know, just a walk around the farm, and we've gone up that ridge, which is kind of, it's technically a paddock, isn't it, Dad? But you didn't really use that much because it was quite steep. Like, I think like the edge of it, like it went up.
No, yeah, it was used, but it is steepish and that sort of thing. So it dries out quicker.
And it had
summer and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and it kind of just had more like thistles and ferns and a bit more wilder.
It always had that.
Yeah, so we had.
Still does.
Yeah, so we had, my brother had the machete and was like chopping through stuff, and it was funny. This story.
Don't be mean.
I still laugh about it now. I know his friends listen to this too, so he was like chopping through the bush like he was like Rambo. I'm pretty sure he thought he was Rambo. Anyway, Mum had taken the machete off him, and just like literally 2 minutes later, he like fell down one of the bloody valleys and landed in a thistle bush, and it was a dried thistle bush, so it was just like just covered in thistles. But we'd gone up this ridge and we came across this, like, it almost looked like a crop circle because of how the grass had been pressed down. So this like long grass had been pressed down, but it was probably about like 20 foot wide, and that was in that same kind of area. So it did look like a nest in the grass.
Yeah, you will get more like deer if they're out grazing, can do that sort of stuff where they'll hunt it down, that sort of thing.
But, you know, like, it didn't look like, you know how you had the venison paddocks, especially when they were like, you know, foaling. They call it foaling when they're deer?
Venison.
Yeah, is it the foaling? Fawning.
Yeah.
And remember how they'd have like the long grass when they were fawning?
Yeah.
And they would kind of make those little nests for their babies, but it didn't look like that.
It didn't look like that?
No. Because I remember going around with Auntie Diana looking for, like, they would go check on the babies.
Yeah.
And they were like kind of smaller than the one that was up there. So it was either a humongous stag that had made it.
Which it could have been.
But that kind of freaked Mum out a bit when we saw that, because it was perfectly, like, swirled.
I don't know. I didn't see it.
No, you weren't there. But yeah, we didn't see Tom Buddy.
Whatever approached me, I never saw it either.
Well, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have wanted to see what made that.
That's why I stayed there so long. I really wanted to see what it was.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But I never did.
I wonder, how many other people in New Zealand had, like, experienced stuff like that, but just never, because they some people wouldn't have even really known about Bigfoot if they weren't really reading into it, or anything like that. So it's kind of like it wouldn't have been something that you ever spoke about. They would have just assumed it was like a huge pig or a deer, probably.
Well, it's like me. I never told anyone. Except for you guys and maybe a couple of other people.
Because that's it. It's kind of like the smell. Like if it smelled like it was rotting, like it could. Sometimes, like if a pig's shot and it survives, could it smell like that?
Not to that extent. That smell. If there was 100 of them like that, maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
It was really strong, like shockingly powerful. And it was very heavy or oily. Like, I know you haven't smelled many animal carcasses, but when the oils and that sort of thing are breaking down, they're floating in the air as well, and they stick to your clothing, so you can still smell it on your clothing and that sort of thing. And this smell, like I said, I could taste it when I started breathing through my mouth because I couldn't take the smell in my nostrils anymore. But it coated my the inside of my nostrils and my tongue and that sort of thing. That's why I'm tasting what I could smell, which is why I had to pull my t-shirt up and cover and still breathe through my mouth to try, to negate the effects of the stench.
Dad, we'll probably have to get you back on to tell the other stories from down there, because I'm sure people are going to want to know now. they're the fun ones. I love those stories. They freak me out, those stories. I think about that often still.
What's that? Which one?
The one with the hunter?
Yeah. Yeah, that was on Bill's Hill.
I don't know, there's some crazy stuff going on in New Zealand.
This crazy stuff goes on everywhere. You just got to be in the right place at the right time for it to happen to you, and have your eyes open and be able to see it. No point looking at your phone all the time. You're not going to see anything that's going on around you. In those days when this happened to me, the story we're talking about, we didn't have any mobile phone.
Okay, so I know a majority of my listeners are from America, and this may be the first time that you've actually heard of the Mahau Man. So stories of the Mahau Man date back to before European settlement. The name Mahau is a Maori name for the highest peak in a mountain range on the Coromandel Peninsula, which is on the North Island of New Zealand. And there are lots of Maori legends that spring from this geological feature. It's a sacred place to the Maori, and it's feared because of the mythical creatures that are supposed to live there, which include the Mahau Man. The other group of supernatural beings that are reported to have lived and maybe still live on Mount Mahau are the Pataparihi. I would love to do a comparison between the Pataparihi and Viracocha and Coaxacoatl, because I actually think that there are a fair few similarities between both those two kind of legends. So if you'd like to hear me do that, please make sure that you let me know in the comments. So while stories of the Mahau Man had been in Maori myth and legend for many generations, it wasn't until the 1870s, 1880s that stories of the Mahau Man began to circulate around the settlers on the Coromandel Peninsula. Firstly, they reported being scared by large human-like creatures, but eventually those stories began to take ominous turns, as there was a gold prospector who had been found killed and mauled. And then a few weeks later, there was a woman who had been living in one of the settlements who appeared to have been dragged out of her home and her neck was snapped. Then coming into the 20th century, there have been sightings dotted here and there. Like in 1903, there were footprints that were found larger than a man in the Karangahaki Gorge in Coromandel. And in 1971, a bushranger found large footprints on snow-covered ground leading into the bush. In 1983, a deer hunter found some large footprints as well, which he said couldn't have been any older than an hour old. In 1991, a group of campers on the South Island of New Zealand decided to just up and leave their camp after they found some really big footprints near where they were set up. A lot of people try to debunk sightings of the Mahau Man by saying that it was actually an escaped gorilla from a shipwreck that happened in 1924. But that doesn't explain why the Maori people had legends and stories and warnings about the Mahau Man. So depending on what region of New Zealand you're in, the description can vary. Similar to how descriptions vary across America of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, skunk ape, the grass man. In general though, they seem to have a very similar description where they're tall, covered in fur, and are described almost like a manimal, so a man animal. Interestingly, a feature for Mahau Man, which is different from descriptions in America or anywhere else, is that the Mahau Man is described as having really long fingernails, almost described like talons. And what's interesting about this is that it's probably because they have the huhu grub as a source of their nourishment, which is found in rotting logs. So it would make sense to have long fingernails to be able to get the grubs out of these logs. I'm going to play for you now a few clips that I found from the Cryptids in New Zealand YouTube channel, and I will make sure to provide all the links in the description box to this YouTube channel if you'd like to check them out.
Kia ora. I was camping in the Aotearoa region, which is about an hour north of Christchurch, South Island, New Zealand, with my family. A great spot, I might add. It was just my partner and our 11-year-old son and I, just to take time out away from the busy lifestyle. This was a daytime sighting, and it happened so fast, I at first got confused. In my logic, I thought, shit, my mind's playing tricks on me. I swung around to my partner, asking her if she saw that. Her reply was no, she retorted back. What did you see? It happened in a section of a pine forest tree line to the left of me. To the right was bordering the road off to State Highway 7 in the Balmoral Forest. A mild day for South Island weather. Our tent was off to the top end and to the side of the road leading to the Hurunui River, which was 300 meters south. My partner was sitting in a camp chair, whilst I was standing looking in the west direction, taking in the beautiful scenery. This creature, because I didn't know what to call it, was that I first sighted it was to my left side, which was moving so bloody fast to the left, northbound direction, and it was hauling ass. It looked like it was trying to get away from something. I don't know. Maybe people were down at the river. I saw it running close to those high voltage power lines. You know, the ones that sometimes you can hear arcing. I heard that they followed these as a path of least resistance. This thing was big, nothing I've ever seen in my entire life. At a guesstimate, distance between it and me would be about 200 meters. Its whole body was covered in hair, indefinitely longer than your average animal, sort of like your woolly mammoth, shaggy and matted, black in colour, but tidy, if this makes sense. I saw its side profile. Its lips were pursed in determination. like it was on a mission. Conical-shaped head and running on 2 legs. It took it like a picture of them and us. I question myself every time I think of my sighting, but from what I've heard, this is a normal thing.
This clip is also taken from the Cryptids in New Zealand YouTube channel, and I'll make sure I link this video in the description box too.
Kia ora. In 1991, when I was a 14-year-old, I practiced a martial art called Aikido. One Sunday morning I got up to go down to the river to practice my weapons kata. This particular morning was cold. Fog had covered the field that I had to walk across to get to the river. It was quiet. I couldn't hear a sound, not even a bird. As I passed the field, I got onto the track. I saw it crouching down, looking as if it were tracking pig or deer prints in the alcove on the other side of the river. I knew it was a Bigfoot. It had its back turned so it didn't see me approaching. It had long dark brown hair that looked black in the dawn light. I kept walking down the river bay. I stopped directly opposite it at about 40 to 50 feet across the river. It finally got up, turned around and saw me. It was startled, took a step back in fright. A second later, when it realised me, it then stepped forward and roared in anger. The sound was like a man's yell, but with the reverberation of a wild beast. I was frozen in fear. It stood over 10 feet tall, weighing around 300 plus kgs. Its face was human-like, but it had long canine teeth. It wasn't bulky like the Patterson-Gimlin film Bigfoot. It was leaner, but very muscular. It had long arms, legs and claws. It had an extra film of skin that would have protected it from the cold. But its body was completely covered in long hair. I could see he was male by his genitalia, even through his coat of hair. His eyes literally turned red with rage. He suddenly turned, lifted a rock that would have weighed over 500 kgs and threw it towards my direction. It landed less than 15 feet from me. He roared again and started beating his chest aggressively. I screamed in absolute terror. He mimicked me. His demeanour changed to twisted and demented. He knew I was scared. He wanted to kill me, but the river was too wide. He proceeded, turning again to pick up another rock, but it was embedded in the ground. He struck it with his long claws. I could see sparks fly as it struck. He started striking out at the tall trees on the river bank, making them shake. The bark from the trees were flying everywhere. He started pacing across the alcove. His giant leaps were long and explosive. I would estimate one powerful stride to be approximately 5 meters. He quickly went into the bush to hide, but it was pointless as my eyes were fixed on him. He even got angrier and came back out throwing a fit along with large branches thrusting it my way. His muscles moved differently from humans. Methodically, he had full control over his body and facial muscles. This is why I believe he had great strength and speed. He carried on running across the alcove in sheer frustration because he couldn't get across the river. I felt safe, started making my way back up the track. He was still roaring and throwing anything that he could into the river. I could hear him carrying on 100 meters away. This whole encounter would have lasted a few minutes. Nobody believed me, as I expected. I didn't care. I knew what I had seen. The next day I went back to investigate. The rock he threw was still in the sand of the riverbed. Where there was minimal current, I swam across and saw claw marks in the rock that he had struck. I tried to find his claw marks in the trees he'd been hitting the previous day. Couldn't see them until I looked further up. They were there, 15 feet. His handspan was massive. I also saw his large footprints in the damp ground. His hair was also stuck in the brush from him pacing. His hair was browny red and black in colour, long and felt wiry, but the cognitive thinking of a 14-year-old I didn't take any as proof.
So I don't know, you guys, what do you think? New Zealand's a pretty mysterious place, and I've had some pretty mysterious encounters there myself, so it's quite possible. I don't know. I feel like if there's anywhere in the world that you could be a wild animal or a wild hominid living and surviving and having everything that you need to survive and flourish, New Zealand would probably be the place. You know, yeah, there are parts of it that get kind of cold, but for the most part, it's not nearly as extreme as places in Canada or the United States that also have descriptions of these like hairy hominids living. Plus, it has freshwater creeks and trout, lots of animals that a creature like a Bigfoot could eat, lots of bugs, and there are no other kind of natural predators. There's no bears, nothing. If you're from New Zealand, or if you've been to New Zealand and had a weird encounter in the bush, please send me an email and tell me what your experience was at aisforalienpodcast@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Alrighty guys, well that's going to be about it from me this week. We've made it to the end of another episode of A is for Alien podcast. Thank you so much for keeping me company. Thank you to everybody who sent me listener emails this week, and also to my own dear dad for taking the time to talk to me about Bigfoot. Having heard from my dad, maybe it makes a bit more sense now for all of you, just where my interest in the paranormal and cryptids and everything bizarre comes from, because obviously, you know, my dad's pretty well read on the subject as well. I'd appreciate it if you took the time to check out my social media pages and connect with me on there. This week I launched a new Reddit page and a Facebook page, so I'd love for you to come and join the conversation over there. That is A is for Alien podcast on both of those platforms there too. And yeah, so next week, what have I got lined up? It's going to be C for clairvoyance. But I bet you already knew that I was going to say that. Oh my god, that has to be the worst joke yet. Alright, okay, I better get going. I'm really bad at goodbyes. I don't really have a sign off yet. I guess the closest one is like stay weird and be excellent to each other. So, you know what, I'm gonna stick with that. Alright, see you guys. See you next week. Bye bye.